Welcome back. Hope you all had a nice break, got a little stretch in, re-leveled the fluids, did all the things that we need to do. Welcome back to the conference and the session that a lot of you have been waiting for, me included. Wanted to quickly thank our sponsor for the session, Teamsters Code 155. Can't do much of what we do without our sponsors, and the Teamsters has been a part of Actsafe forever. Great people. Thank you for bringing us here. And just a reminder, afterwards, we do have bingo. Make sure you got your stuff together for that. So I get to introduce this gentleman who's beside me here, who's been a friend for quite a while now. I'm always so happy to see him. I don't read his bio because it's too long and it's so exceptional. What I can tell you is he's a great friend. He supports Actsafe, and he supports the entire industry with his incredible depth of knowledge in the legal world as well as events, and it's just always so much fun to hang out with him. Coming to you from sunny South Scottsdale, Arizona, ladies and gentlemen, it's Mr. Steve Adel.
Well, thank you, Don. That's such a nice introduction. So just so you folks, watching this know, the inside joke there is I really hate when people read a bio. Reading bios is really boring. I've made my bio shorter and shorter, and still people read, Steve Adelman is an attorney in Scottsdale. It's like, oh my God, just put me to sleep. So that's why Don does the informal intro. And Don, you did it beautifully, as you always do. Way to land it perfectly. So what we're going to do here today, and Sam, I cannot see my slide deck yet, but I'm not concerned because I know you've got this. There we go. Look at that. What we're going to do today is basically therapy for me. So thanks very much for your help. You can stay on the first slide for a second, Sam. What we're going to do is basically therapy for me. So let me kind of tee up the conversation. I do a lot of writing and speaking about safety and security at live events. I'll show you my fabulous credentials in just a second so you know why, but this is what I do for a living. And often the topics are fairly esoteric. I'm often asked to get into the weeds of event operations, or whether it's better for governments to regulate safety and security at live events, or for us to be largely a self-regulating industry. I'm asked to comment on, why something seems to have gone sideways. Do I have the answers? People are always looking for answers, even when we don't even know the right questions. And, frankly, it's exhausting. It's exhausting to always be, fending off questions that are well-intentioned but ill-informed, and trying to reframe them into something that's really useful. And every so often I long to just have a life and, just be a guy. And last month, I actually had one of those wonderful opportunities. I got married, and I was away and largely off the grid for a week. And yet something happened in our world that jerked me back into live event safety and health and security issues. And I didn't really know what to do with it at first. And so I did what any normal person would do on their honeymoon. I ignored it because I was just having too much fun and was too euphorically happy. And, glad to say I still am. But eventually I did turn my attention to this story. I figured out what was irritating me about it, because something really was. It was like a stone in my shoe. And ultimately, when I did figure it out, I put together my analysis in the slide deck that I'm going to show you today. So this is going to make me feel better. I hope that it makes you at least think, which is a tall order for a Friday afternoon. So if you don't have a beverage of your choice nearby, what are you waiting for? And, maybe grab one while I go through my fabulous credentials, but I will do that quite quickly. And then we'll get to the story, because I think this story is really important. It's a 20,000-foot view story of what we're always trying to do every day. So it started on the micro level and quickly grew to a kind of macro consideration of why do we think about safety the way we do in the first place? So this deck is called The Importance of Knowing What's Important. And the word important is in quotation marks because someone used it in a way that bugged me to the point where I thought really deeply about what they meant. And then I asked them, and when they gave me an answer, I thought to myself, that doesn't sound right. Let's try harder. So that's what this is about. It's about trying harder to understand what's important about keeping events safe and understanding why we do what we do. So this is a talk about motivation and knowing what's right, which I think are really important. So with that, we can now proceed. And by the way, you will hear me, those of you watching this, you will hear me, reference next slide or Sam, would you advance or something like that? It's because we had a little technical issue, but because we are professionals, we just get to yes. And in this case, yes is Sam's expert work behind the scenes. So you will hear me, reference Sam Hindle, and she's doing a fabulous job making this seem seamless, but I'm telling you what's behind the curtain anyway, because I want her to get credit. All right. So with that, I introduced the topic. Let me briefly introduce myself. Hi, I'm Steve Edelman. You already know I'm in Scottsdale, Arizona. That's why I'm wearing short sleeves. It's nice here. I have lots of credentials relevant to safety and security at live events. Rather than me telling them to you or asking Don to read them, here they are, depicted both graphically and narratively. So I don't have to boast, I can just let you read. But suffice to say, this is what I do for a living. I think about safety and security and live events. During the worst of the pandemic, I spent quite a lot of time as a COVID compliance nerd. And if you're familiar with any of my social media posts, you know that I have a fabulous safety yellow fez, which if someone asks, I will go across my living room and put on my head during the Q&A. Anyway, that is what we're dealing with. Sam, would you do the next slide? So I already told you I got married in January. This is me and Sally at the hotel that we stayed in. It was beautiful. It was wonderful. I am euphorically, just nauseatingly happy. So next slide, please. Another thing that you ought to know about me, these are not my credentials, but things that you ought to know is I'm a big soccer fan. We can call it by its right name. It's football. And I always have been. This is me at age 8 or 9, I think. And the arrow is there because I don't really look like that so much any longer, but I do still play. And so I pay attention to football, particularly English Premier League. Alas, I'm a Tottenham Hotspurs fan, so I'm sort of wounded right now. But anyway, I do follow world football. So those are two things that you ought to know about me personally. Let's go to the next slide, please. Now, here's the beginning of the story. So I got married in mid-January, and during my honeymoon, while Sally was making herself even more beautiful, I would look at my phone. And of course, I'm not dealing with heavy news. I'm on my honeymoon. So I'm reading ESPN and just seeing what's going on in the world of football. And I see this story in ESPN in which they talk about a disaster outside of a football stadium in the African nation of Cameroon. Now, I'm a fairly smart guy, and I like to think that I'm not so provincial that I don't know the world outside of Scottsdale. But I do not know where Cameroon is, except that it's on the continent of Africa. So I do what I think a reasonable person does. I look it up, and I found out that it is, well, where the arrow shows. And on the right side of that screen is an exploded view, so you can see what Cameroon looks like. So now you know where it is and what it is. The capital of the nation of Cameroon is Yaoundé, and I think that's the correct way to pronounce it. And the reason that there was a story about a soccer stadium disaster in Yaoundé, Cameroon, is because the nation of Cameroon was the host nation for a continental soccer tournament called the Africa Cup of Nations, which is an awkward title. It makes me think of a giant cup with all the African nations. And there are a lot of countries in Africa, but don't get hung up on that. I just did anyway. So the Africa Cup of Nations had as its host country Cameroon. And the national stadium in the national capital of Yaoundé was a new stadium purpose-built for hosting the Africa Cup of Nations. And it was like the second or third match that was hosted at this stadium. And there apparently was an ingress disaster. The short version is fans hadn't attended in large numbers for the first match for the Africa Cup of Nations tournament at the new national stadium. And so event organizers, wanting there to be a more attractive looking crowd, gave out free tickets. Can you imagine what happens to the crowd size when you pass out lots of free tickets? Actsafe did for this event. So I'm hoping that the crowd size watching this conversation right now has blossomed accordingly, because free is good. So in the nation of Cameroon, in their national stadium, the crowd outside was quite large. Even though they had not paid, they were eager to get in to watch some, international football. Alas, the event organizers were not really hip to the size or eagerness of the crowd, and so they did not open the doors early enough, and the crowd got increasingly dense and agitated outside. Now, I know that I'm speaking to you from the United States, but those of you with some knowledge of international crowd disasters may be thinking right now, this scenario, an ingress disaster outside of an arena or someplace like that, this sounds familiar. This sounds almost old-timey. And one shouldn't get fooled again by things that happened a long time ago. So there, I've hinted broadly enough. This is basically the same thing that happened in Cincinnati, Ohio, in the States back in 1979, outside of Riverfront Coliseum, a building that no longer exists, when the Who were doing sound check. And the good folks who operate Riverfront Coliseum didn't open enough doors. So when they did open a few doors, the densely packed, really cold crowd, because it was January, were eager to get inside for their own reasons. And there was a crowd crush of people trying to ingress when there really should never be, but there was one. And we've had ingress disasters since then as well. But for US crowd management people like myself, the Who disaster in 1979 was kind of our original sin, much like in the UK, the Hillsborough tragedy was their original sin. And we try to mark that in time and never recreate the exact same mechanism of disaster. Anyway, so I'm reading this on my phone while I'm lying in bed, waiting for my new wife to get her makeup just so. And I see this story. It is ostensibly a sports story because it happened during the Africa Cup of Nations, but I don't really see the sports angle. It's just an ingress disaster. But it does catch my eye for the following reason. Next slide, please. And here's the reason it caught my eye, because as someone who deals with risk and safety at live events, I'm always perturbed when people die. And in this instance, 8 people perished, including children ages 8 and 14. So that's bad. I recognize that is very, very bad. And what I learned over the next couple of days as I briefly checked into ESPN.com again is the government of Cameroon, well, they were right on top of this. And they commissioned, the president of the country, I guess, commissioned a report. And well, unlike in North America, where reports take a long time, In Cameroon, lightning fast, lickety split. They had an analysis, a written report. They came to conclusions. They found the answers. And the answers basically were, everything is fine. We just needed to, open a door or two, and nothing to see here, people. Everybody come on back to the national stadium in Yaoundé because, well, Egypt is coming to play, and Mohamed Salah of Liverpool is, a giant attraction in Africa, and, it's all good. Come on back. And that took a week, that report. And I was curious to see, what does a investigation into the deaths of 8 and 38 injuries, what does a report fashioned in a week or so look like? So I didn't do a lot of searching. It was still my honeymoon, but I was curious. And well, while I was kind of perusing the internet looking for this Cameroonian investigative report that was referenced in news stories but never linked, which is deeply irritating if you're ever going into journalism. If you cite something, link it, because people want to read the original source. At least I do. Anyway, while I was in increasing frustration, looking for this magical investigative report from the nation of Cameroon, explaining exactly what happened to the 8 and 38 and why it was not going to happen again, I came upon another story from Cameroon. Sam, next slide, please. The other story is that there had been another disaster, actually a prior disaster, also related to the Africa Cup of Nations tournament and the fact that Yaoundé was the host city in the host nation. There was another disaster just 2 nights earlier, and that one was even worse. Next slide, please. What I learned, basically noodling on ESPN, and then I went down the rabbit hole, is a nightclub also in Yaoundé, so catering to people who had come to the capital for the soccer tournament, at a place called Live's Nightclub. 17 people died, so twice as many plus 1. 17 people died and 8 more were seriously hurt. And fire is a good way to get seriously hurt, because they did something that I think is self-evidently a bad idea, but still customary in a lot of places, which is in celebration of their nations getting to the capital, they lit fireworks inside of the nightclub as part of the champagne toast. And well, when they lit fireworks inside of a building, it lit the building's ceiling on fire. Again, my point of reference tends to be US-centric. I apologize to my good Canadian friends. But I'm a transplanted New Englander, and what immediately came to my mind was The Station, which was a nightclub in West Warwick, Rhode Island, that burnt to the ground, taking exactly 100 people to their deaths because pyrotechnics lit the club's ceiling on fire back in February of 2003. And then, just because that wasn't bad enough, the same thing happened at a nightclub in Russia, the Lame Horse nightclub in Perm. And if you're irritated with Russia, let's go to Brazil, because the same thing happened again at the Kiss nightclub. And the owners of that club, after 243 people died in Brazil, the owners of that club went to jail. That happened actually quite recently. And so I'm thinking to myself, wow, this is actually a really bad weekend in Cameroon, but I'm still on my honeymoon and I'm not really eager to deal with this stuff. So I climbed out of the rabbit hole, went back to my state of domestic bliss, and enjoy the rest of my time largely off the grid. Next slide, please. And I had happier things to think about. And you can see in our sunglasses reflected palm trees, because it was really paradise. We were on California's Central Coast. This is Santa Barbara. Next slide. But when we came back, thank you, Sam, good job. When we came back, the world intruded again, and my thoughts went back to what they usually do, which is, well, safety and security at live events. And as it turns out, I got an email. This is the exact text, minus the identifying information, because I do like to protect the innocent. This guy does not know that I'm citing his emails, but here it is. So I will do a dramatic reading right now because, well, it's Friday afternoon and you deserve a little drama. So here it is. This is an email that I received on Monday, January 31, from someone from a major news organization. And let's just leave it at that. Mr. Edelman, I'm working on a long-term investigative project about what happened at Astroworld. You remember Astroworld? It was the hip hop festival in Houston, Texas in November, where 10 people died. Seems that they all died of compressive asphyxia, which is what happens when you're in a crowd that's too densely packed. Basically, the weight of other people on one's chest causes one's heart to stop beating. Your brain is deprived of oxygen, and eventually you expire. So that happened to 10 people at a music festival in Houston, Texas. So that's what he's talking about. I'm working on a long-term investigative project about what happened at Astroworld. Can we talk on the phone or Zoom? At this point, the conversation would be private, off the record, eager to hear your insights. Well, I got that email at 12:20 p.m. my time, and I gave it a good think. Here were some of my thoughts. One, I know quite a lot about Astroworld. I am involved on several different levels with what happened and its aftermath, including being on two different commissions, one for the state of Texas, one for Houston and Harris County. And I'm also involved in the litigation, although it's not active for me yet. But I know a fair amount about it. So I do have some insights, but I, being a lawyer, I remember my legal training, even though it was quite a while ago. And we learned in law school, Boston College Law School, which I'm very proud of. We learned at Boston College Law School that you gather evidence before you render judgment. Because if you don't render judgment, that means that you are a pundit. You're a pundit. You're someone who issues pronouncements without evidence. And frankly, I have no interest in doing that. So when he wrote, I'm working on a long-term investigative project about what happened at Astroworld, my first thought was, I know a bunch of people who are working on long-term investigative projects about what happened at Astroworld. They're all lawyers, and they're going to engage in the discovery process that is the right way to investigate something, at least the way that I learned how to do it. And I'm going to respect that process. I don't know what happened at Astroworld. Certainly, I don't know the cause of anyone's death. And there's a lot of information that will come out over the next, I don't know how many years, and it will be worked over by a lot of lawyers who are going to work very hard at this and probably bill a lot of money. So do I have insights? Yeah, I have some, but nothing about what this guy wanted to talk about. And incidentally, I'm not cynical. I am skeptical. I'm a trust but verify kind of guy. But I've dealt with the media enough over the years to read that sentence at this point, the conversation will be private off the record, to be less than fully reassuring. And so with all of those thoughts in mind, I demurred. I decided that I would not speak to him, he was a guy, and share the uninformed by evidence insights that I had. I would not play pundit. I would not feed the media beast, not at that point. So I said, no, thanks. Next slide, please. And he was polite, he understood, and he wrote, "I appreciate it. Good luck with the work. This is an important one." This is an important one. And that was the stone in my shoe, that sentence. This is an important one. Well, here's how the conversation continued. Next slide, please. So I wrote back, and this is all still going on the Monday right after I returned from my honeymoon. Now it's 8:35 at night. I'm a hardworking big city lawyer, so I'm still catching up from my week of domestic bliss, hard at work. And here's what I wrote. Next slide, please. I had a lot to say. And here's what I said. More dramatic reading for you. I wrote, "Your last comment is interesting. I agree that Astroworld is important, but I think it's useful to explore why we feel that way. Guns," so here's my rant, "guns have taken far more lives at live events than crowd crushes, the two worst mass shootings in US history, Route 91 in Las Vegas and Pulse in Orlando, were both at events," which is true, and glean from that some small measure of schadenfreude. If you're listening to this conversation in Canada, feel good about that. You may be cold, but at least there are fewer guns pointed in your direction than there are in mine here in Arizona. I continued. "Fires kill far more people at once. One of the highest fatality building fires in US history was the station fire in West Warwick, Rhode Island, that I just mentioned to you guys, which killed exactly 100 people. And that remains a problem." And then I cite the ghost ship fire, which was a warehouse being used as a performance and living space in Oakland, California. But our attention is diverted from that pretty quickly as well. Even fatal crowd crushes at events, such as Astroworld, are neither new nor do they capture public attention for long. 11 people died trying to enter Riverfront Coliseum, that's the WHO disaster, and 45 Israeli pilgrims died trying to leave the Lag BaOmer religious festival in Israel only last April. So I'm talking to him about his comment that Astroworld is important. Next slide. I continued. "I'm interested in recognizing parties," so here's my perspective. "I'm interested in recognizing parties that act consistent with safety standards and calling out those that don't." That's my whole perspective. That's why, when I'm serving as a testifying expert, I'm pretty agnostic about whether I'm on the side of a plaintiff or a defendant. I advocate for safe practices, and whoever is engaged in safe practices, I'm their guy. So that's what that first sentence means. As an advocate for safe practices in an industry I care about, that's why I think this case is important. It's another opportunity to identify the causes of a horrendous outcome, then allocate fault based on evidence, not the court of social media or other public opinion. And then my last sentence in the email, "What makes this story important to you?" And if we hadn't had our little technical glitch, I would have had these slides set up so that you would first see the big block of text, and then the last sentence would appear slowly after I'd already finished reading for a dramatic effect. It would be dramatic. It was quite fabulous, but we did have a little technical issue. So Sam is doing a wonderful job of recreating, to the best of our ability, the drama of this email exchange. So my last question to this reporter, what makes this story important to you? For me, it's important about rewarding people who do things safely and calling out those who don't. That's why I think it's important. Okay, Mr. Reporter, fess up. Why do you think it's important? Next slide. Here's what he said. He writes back next morning, actually the next afternoon. "Well," and this is my yellow, Well, I think the Astroworld story is important because 10 people are dead. We'll come back to that thought. And because informed, experienced people I've spoken with have explained that it was preventable. Let's stick with that one for just a second. I'll read it again, emphasis added. And because informed, experienced people I've spoken with have explained that it was preventable, which made me think, what was preventable? What exactly do you think these people are referring to, these informed, experienced people? Because respectfully, I'm an informed, experienced person. I also went to law school and learned that evidence precedes judgment. Otherwise, you're just a damn pundit, and I have no interest in being a pundit. What was preventable? At this point, it is not known. Passive voice used for emphasis because no one knows. The discovery process has not even begun yet, and it will take literally years to figure out what made that night, Jewish people perk up, what made that night different than all other nights. There have been lots of music festivals with general admission areas barricaded in exactly the same configuration. What made that show different than all other similarly configured shows? There have been lots of hip hop festivals on parking lots. What made that festival different than all other similarly created and promoted hip hop festivals? There have been other Travis Scott shows. Most of them have gone fine, some notoriously not, but there's no common denominator there either because the vast majority of shows where he was on stage, they all went fine. What made that night different than all other nights? It is not known. So I took a very jaundiced view of the informed, experienced people this reporter was talking to. And this is kind of my internal monologue. So if you're ever having a friendly chat with me, recognize that I am, evaluating your words on multiple levels at the same time. Some are delighted with what you're saying. Some are just really pissed off, and they're all happening at the same time. My brain is just a maelstrom of conflicting thoughts and ideas. Anyway, that's what I'm thinking about the second sentence. Essentially, the word "it" has really pissed me off. But back to the first sentence. Well, I think Astroworld is important because 10 people are dead. And that brought me back to Cameroon. Next slide, please. So this is an image of Lady Justice. There I am. Yes, we don't need to read any longer. So this is an image of Lady Justice. She's wearing a blindfold, and the usual way that we see her is she's holding scales, the scales of justice, and you weigh one side versus the other side, and the weightier argument carries the day. That's how it's supposed to be. That's what I learned in law school. And you can look at the crest of many places that teach law and nations around the world, and they'll have some variation on the scales of justice. So I'm pretty confident that's the right image to use here. So let's go to the next slide, please. And I applied the scales of justice to the assertion that this reporter made that, well, the reason that Astroworld is important is because 10 people died. And the stone in my shoe was really hurting at that point because, well, 10 people at a music festival with a famous performer, I don't think weighs as much as 25 dead at 2 events over one weekend, even though they took place in a place that few people that I know or that look like me could find on a map. And it really bothered me. It bothered me because I just got married. Next slide. And what occurred to me is that everyone has someone that they love, or at least that they like well enough to think that the sheer number of deceased is almost irrelevant. I say almost because at some level, of course, it does matter. But 10 to me doesn't weigh as much as 25, and they're both bad. They're both numbers that should make you say, whoa, this is clearly unacceptable. How does this happen? And has something like this happened before? And if it has, are there lessons that we can draw out of this quickly? So if it's a nightclub fire caused by people lighting the ceiling, maybe there are lessons there. And if you're familiar with the National Fire Protection Association, they have an entire life safety code, a fire protection handbook, which is replete with valuable advice about how to not do that. And if you're familiar with the story of, the Who tuning up in Cincinnati, or Black Friday patrons on Long Island in New York wanting to get a cheap TV over American Thanksgiving, that ingress is a problematic situation. Hillsborough is not the first or last word on anything. And so this whole concept of Astroworld's important because 10 people died. No, it's just wrong. And so the therapy part is, I wanted to say what's right, because I'm a glass half full guy. I like to accentuate the positive, especially on a Friday afternoon. There will be bourbon in my near future and maybe in yours. So let's draw something useful out of this. How can you know what's important? Next slide, Sam. There are a couple of ways. I, being a lawyer, always revert first to the law. So the law gives us, and this is common law, so it applies no less in Canada, wherever you are, whether you're in BC or Alberta or any place else in Canada. It's basic common law. And it is simply the concept that everyone has a legal duty to behave reasonably under their own circumstances. So the image is, a story I've told many times over the years. I love Blue Man Group, and blue men never break character. So if you're a knucklehead like me and you try to speak to a blue man and have a conversation with them, you would be disappointed as I was, and hopefully the light bulb would go off over your head as it eventually did over mine. And then I stopped talking and started using my eyes and my body, because that's how a blue man communicates. The point being, we all have a duty to behave reasonably under whatever circumstances we are working in or existing in at that time. So if you give away free tickets to an in-person general admission event, you have to open enough doors so people don't get crushed trying to get into a few doors. That should be self-evident, but the point is, the mistake that roughly parallels that keeps happening, which means not enough people have digested my silly blue man story, at least not enough to understand if you are not behaving reasonably under your own circumstances, then you are not behaving reasonably. So how to understand what is important from a health and safety standpoint when you are working? One way is look at the environment in which you are doing your work. What is reasonable there? And if you are thinking, well, I know the best practice for this environment, no, you don't. You don't, because the legal rule is to, let's see, we'll do this as multiple choice. This will be rhetorical, but fun anyway. Your options are, you can either do what is best, because that's what the law requires, or you can do what's reasonable under your circumstances. Choose the second one? Yes. The reason for that is there is no one best standard, best practice that applies everywhere all the time. If you are, managing a crowd in, an opera house in Vancouver, you're going to have a very different crowd than, say, a country music festival in the summertime in Alberta, because the demographics are different, the level of excitement is different, the level of intoxication is different, the size of the people is different, the age of the people is probably different also. And so all of the crowd management decisions, even down to signage and announcements, the announcements have to be louder for the older folks at the opera house, don't they? And for the country music folks, well, you have to give them more often because, yeah, they're not paying attention. You know that, so you have to do what's reasonable under those circumstances. Next slide. So that's one way of understanding what's important. And the other way is, well, the way that I did, which is I was coming off of my honeymoon, nauseatingly in love and happy, as I still am today. And my vantage point on the juxtaposition of what this reporter said, Astroworld is important because 10 people died, versus the way I experienced the news during my honeymoon, oh my God, 2 utterly preventable tragedies took the lives of 25 people on a continent that I have never visited, in a nation I couldn't find on a map. But those people all had someone who loved them and who is grieving right now. And every life matters. I could not weigh, like the scales of justice, I couldn't weigh the value of 10 people in Houston versus 25 in Cameroon. I can't do that. And I wouldn't want to, and I bet you don't either. So when I think about what's important, ultimately, for me, it's what's in my own heart, which is there is somebody I love, and I would be devastated beyond words if anything happened to her. And that's just the end of the story. And it's not comparative at all. It's just absolute. So that's ultimately how I think about what's important, and candidly, what motivates me to, exchange emails with a reporter who I'm increasingly annoyed with at 8:30 on the first night that I'm back at work after my honeymoon, because this stuff drives me. As I know it drives you, because you're participating in a conference on a Friday afternoon, and you've sort of hung in there with me telling you stuff that is hard to hear, doesn't yield easy answers, because there are none. There are none. Do you have insights about whatever is your most recent tragedy? Sure. Answers? Yeah, a lot fewer of those. So to me, this is the analysis that I work through when somebody says, oh, a disaster is important. This is how I think about it. And for me to talk about it, it's therapeutic, because it took me a week to unravel this. Frankly, it took me longer than that, but I wrote about it first, and then I created this slide deck. And each time that I talk about it, frankly, I'm getting deeper into my own thoughts about why we do the work that we do, why we care about safety. And ultimately, it's not because we fear lawsuits. I'm a lawyer. I don't fear lawsuits. Frankly, they put food on my table. I don't fear bad publicity. I'm good with the media. I can handle that. I fear losing people that I love. And I have a fairly big heart. There are a lot of people that I care about. I don't want to lose any of them. So that's, to me, how I measure what's important. Next slide, Sam. So that's therapy with Steve. There you go. I hope that stirred up some thoughts. This is what we do. We sell the dream, but we live the reality. And the reality is, a lot of the work that we do has risks for ourselves, our friends working back of house, our patrons, even the performers, we do work that has lots of risks. And our job is to mitigate those risks, say yes to crazy ideas, and make magic. And I love that we make magic. I do. I love it. I frankly cannot wait to get the hell back out there and be standing on stage right, watching cool things happen. And there's a hint, by the way, I like to be on stage right. And, you know, we do really cool, wonderful stuff, but it is full of risk. And so we have to take this sort of conversation seriously, and whatever motivates us to think about safety as broadly as we can so that we don't forget. That's what I encourage you to do. So, thank you for your time.
Well, that's a lot to think about, Steve. I don't see any questions in the Q&A at the moment. Does anybody have any questions they want to throw into the chat that we can discuss here? We've got a few minutes left. Love to continue the chat going forward. Because now that we're in the Q&A, thank you, Carolyn. There's the request for the Fez right there.
All right, hang on just 1 second. I'll be right back.
So I'll throw in a little bit of context for you from there. It is. The safety monitor is back, so we all better behave. The Fez is here. So a little bit of context. There's lots of conversation about Astroworld and lots of other things that have happened in the past, even in BC, Canada. Look at what happened in Toronto, that investigation, you know,
right.
and
that went on for years and legally went completely sideways.
So there are some differing opinions on all this, but from the safety side of things, it's always very tricky because it's based on facts. It's based on things that actually happen, and it's really hard to determine those. And to look at these things from a dispassionate position, so that you can look at things based on what actually happened and the research that goes into that. The really disappointing part about a lot of this is that a lot of those findings never get shared publicly, which is, I think, it is a major problem in order to move safety forward. And as Steve pointed out, we keep repeating our problems. And whether that be between Rhode Island, which is, any of you who've done that training, oh my God, is just absolutely horrendous to watch. But there's jurisdictional issues. So that information not moving, even in the US between states, in Canada between provinces, and even different interpretations of the same code. In Canada, we're having lots of conversations about the electrical code right now, right? But different interpretations in different jurisdictions mean the laws that are written because people lost their lives are not being interpreted in the same way. So this is not just an exclusive problem to an investigation into Astroworld. There's also issues with how that information is dealt with, disseminated, and reused, which is also part of the conversation that Steve and I've had almost every time we have this conversation, some point during the conference. So I'm so glad you brought this up, and we can beat it up a little bit publicly.
We are repetitive. You know, the challenge is always to find some hook so that people don't just become numb and think, oh, you know, F this, we can't do anything about it, so let's just go on. In the absence of questions, I will talk to you about one more thing that I care about, which is it's a sociological concept. It's called the normalization of deviance. The normalization of deviance means we know that stuff doesn't happen correctly, but when it doesn't yield any negative consequence, when stuff doesn't go wrong, even though we don't do things the right way, we just get used to it. And eventually we become blind to the problem and we don't care. The normalization of deviance is what happens when you are basically playing Russian roulette with safety. Because eventually, if you keep doing things the wrong way, something bad will happen. And this is a very important concept for people who engage in behavior with a significant downside risk. The normalization of deviance it's a constant problem because we're focused on doing our work, and our work is time consuming and tiring and requires a lot of focus that we don't always have. It's hard to be locked in all the time. So I'm giving you the term normalization of deviance so that you know, number one, it's not just you. Number two, it's a thing because it has a name. And number three, even though it's really difficult, it is all of our task all the time to push back against the instinct, don't worry about it. It's never caused a problem, even though it's wrong. There's a reason that we distinguish between the right way versus the wrong way. And we do. We all do. You know what the right way is to do something, even if it's more difficult, even if it's a pain in the ass and you have other things to do, you can still distinguish between the right and the wrong way. The reason to do things the right way is because you want to avoid normalizing doing things the wrong way, because that eventually tends to yield, well, Don and I talking about you.
Yes. or stories like.
Yeah.
Holly Vivian just posted a great example in the chat there.
Yeah.
Ladders on wheels, right? Like we know how wrong it is and how dangerous, but we just can't stop ourselves from doing it.
Right.
Great example.
Yeah, I mean, I have several cases right now involving yellow jackets, cable ramps. Cable ramps are themselves trip hazards. They're just better than exposed cable. So you have to do something to alert people even to the presence of a cable ramp, because it is a change in the elevation of flooring. And it doesn't seem that difficult. Yet I see cable ramps in the dark. I mean, that yellow surface, it's retroreflective, which means it needs a light source in order to reflect. I mean, come on, people, this is basic science. So we deal with this sort of issue all the time in our work. We're constantly surrounded by hazards large and small, whether it's people celebrating in a dangerous way or not opening doors, or we don't know what the cause was of some tragedy. I mean, we're in a risky business.
100%. 100%. Any other questions coming through? Otherwise, I'm just going to keep throwing stuff at Steve.
Hi, Don. There's a question in the Q&A.
Oh, why am I not seeing
Don's not being attentive. Sam's calling him out.
No, the little icon didn't come up. And there's two people. How to navigate people's different understanding or sense of risk to get buy-in. Oh, man. And just before Steve attempts to answer this is a separate course we're building on risk assessments. It's a whole thing. Steve, what are your thoughts on that one?
Krista, you waited until now to ask this question? Good Lord. I have nothing succinct to say. This is the subject of entire courses. And, I'm thrilled that Actsafe is going to do a proper training on risk assessments. My organization, the Event Safety Alliance, we're creating one also, not for the Event Safety Summit next month, but upcoming, because there are so many different varieties of risk assessment. So let me briefly embellish that thought. I am, among my fabulous credentials, is that I led a group that created the ANSI standard. ANSI is the American National Standards Institute, the ANSI standard for crowd management, which I think is a very useful work. And now I am leading a similar group, which is creating an ANSI standard for event security. The part of the text that we're writing right now is about how security deployments basically require security professionals to look at each possible area of an event site and do a mini risk assessment for that site. So if there's a doorway, do you need a security guard there? Maybe you do. If so, why? What is the risk? Do you need more than one? Maybe you don't need one to stand post there, but can be covered by a rover. Or maybe no one ever goes through that doorway because the door is always closed and locked, in which case you don't need to secure it at all. But the point is, even for a basic dot map for security on an event site, that is a series of small risk assessments. So Krista, I love your question, but it is really hard to answer at the end of a chat. So Matt's question, so now I can see these too. What are the odds that your major news network reporter contacts you again after the Astroworld investigation is complete? Matt, the reality of American mass casualty litigation. So the correct name for a case where there are literally thousands, plural, of lawsuits already filed, it's called a mass tort case. The reality is they take years, and not 2, but 4, 5, 6 years to resolve. The resolution is almost invariably by settlement, meaning there will not be a final report, outcome, declaration of exactly what happened. It's just that everyone will take money and go away. And that includes plaintiffs, defendants, lawyers, everyone. They'll just take money and go away. So the odds that this reporter even remembers me, is even still working in journalism, yeah, pretty slim. I don't expect it. Don Parman.
I have a little bit of a follow-up to that, and that's great question, Matt. And yes, the litigation system, the way it all works, it takes a long time. Same thing with it's similar to what happened in Toronto with the stage collapse. It can be a long time. What's from the safety perspective, from the safety professional side of things, it's that interim period when all that information is locked up in investigations. That's the most detrimental period, is when if there's information inside that can't get out to the industry to do something with it, it is massively frustrating. We do have in BC anyways, and in Ontario too, but you can see how well it worked there. There are mechanisms that can trigger some of that information coming out, like a coroner's inquest. Although coroner's inquests are no way binding, but what it does do is get information out. So that's why, and it can be a little bit tricky after that once a coroner's inquest is done and stuff. But that is one of the loopholes we do have here, where some information can come out. And in a couple of provinces, the Health and Safety Authority, or AESC, also has the ability to do a separate investigation that doesn't play into the legal matters, whether there's charges and whether there's a lawsuit, but they can do their own investigation, and those findings can be shared at a certain level. So that's one of the advantages we do have here, although that still takes quite a while before any of that comes out.
So, Matt, I don't want to leave you with just a completely negative answer, because I am relentlessly glass half full. So regarding Astroworld, in the aftermath of that, both the governor of the state of Texas, as well as municipal leaders from the city of Houston and the county in which Houston is, Harris County, they have created task forces not to analyze what happened at Astroworld. There's an army of lawyers who's going to do that for years, but rather to look forward and to figure out, are there things that can be done in our respective jurisdictions that will make events safer, better, on a going forward basis? And I love that thinking, because, in the years between now and whenever, there is some kind of resolution of the Astroworld lawsuits, thousands of lawsuits, in that long period of time, there are going to be a lot of events in the state of Texas, in the city of Houston, and in Harris County. There are going to be a lot of events. They're not stopping. So I love that the various, legislative and jurisdictional leaders have decided to look forward because they got to come up with some of their own. Well, they have to identify what issues had some contribution by them and then address them. And they're doing that. And I think that's really constructive. Frankly, it's pretty laudable. And they're both on a fairly quick time frame because they're sensitive to the fact that litigation takes far too long and they can and want to act a lot faster.
That is a little bit of good news. And unfortunately, we have to end on that because it is time. And I'm on a tight timeline because Remo doesn't let us linger for too long. So
right, and I was supposed to give you an extra minute and I blew it.
Our timing's bang on. So again, thank you so much for being here, Steve. Thanks for everybody for the questions. Keep the questions coming. I can always pass them on to Steve, or his information is going to be coming out in the slide deck. So please keep the questions coming because I know there's one we didn't get to, but we will do our best to answer that in another session throughout the next couple of days. So again, thanks so much for joining us, Steve, and we look forward to being able to do this in person next year, as well as many other things I'm sure that we're going to be involved with in the next little while. So, and congratulations so much on your recent nuptials. It's great to see that great big grin on your face, and thank you for joining us. Last little bit of housekeeping. Bingo's coming up next. The Zoom link for bingo should be coming your way momentarily. I believe Sam's also shared it in the chat. And we absolutely love having these sessions. So again, thanks for joining us, Steve. Get out there and check out ESA. Their big event is coming up soon, and there's more news coming down the pipe as well from them. So keep an eye on their website and become a member. All of you. Did I get that right?
Yeah. No, great. Thank you, everyone. Right. Thank you, Don. Thank you, Sam, for your excellent help.
Thanks, everybody.